So in this session, we're going to look at the open source PowerBuilder Foundation classes. Now, if you're fairly new to PowerBuilder, this may be something you're not familiar with. For many of us, though, that have been around PowerBuilder for a long time, this is something that's been available since about PowerBuilder 5 or so, not as open source originally, and we'll get into that when we get into the history, but it's a library that's been around for a while. So first thing we're going to have is a legal disclaimer. And then let's look at the agenda. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is why you would want to use the PowerBuilder Foundation classes if you're not already using them. Next thing I want to talk about is if you're currently using an older version of the PowerBuilder Foundation classes, why you might want to upgrade to the newer version. If you decide to do that, we're going to talk about how you do that upgrade. And then lastly, we're going to look at how you can be involved. This is an open source project, so you can actually contribute to the PowerBuilder Foundation classes as well. So first, a little bit about me. My name is Bruce Armstrong. I've been using PowerBuilder since about 1.0b, and I'm one of the people that contributes to the open source PowerBuilder Foundation classes. Some of my other skills are PowerBuilder, obviously, Oracle, PL SQL, Java, C#, and C++. This is a little bit about the company I work for. Okay, so why would you want to use the PFC framework? Let's look at the history first of all. So this was originally developed by Sybase, and it was released with PowerBuilder 5 in 1995. So when you bought PowerBuilder, you got a copy of this library with PowerBuilder. When PowerBuilder hit version 10 in 2005, Sybase decided to release it as an open source project. And that's when myself and a number of other people took it over. We originally had it on the Sybase Code Exchange site, but then Sybase shut that down, so we moved to Microsoft CodePlex in 2014. But maybe PFC is bad news for software hosting sites because Microsoft shut that down. And so in 2017, we moved to GitHub, and we've been there since. Apparently, we may be bad news for software hosting sites, but we're not strong enough to take down GitHub. And so this is the current location of the libraries on GitHub. Okay, so let's talk about why you would want to use the PFC framework. And what I'm actually going to do is, first of all, refer to why would you want to use any open source software? You know, the PowerBuilder Foundation classes are open source. They give you the advantages that open source gives you. And so this is from a document that I've linked down there at the bottom. I'm not covering every point that this person covered, but I thought I'd pull out a few of them that made the most sense in a PowerBuilder environment. So the first one is agility. If there's a feature that you believe is missing in PowerBuilder, you don't have to wait for the developer to, in this case Appian, to necessarily provide that capability. If there's, if somebody that's working in the PFC project develops something that provides that capability, you use the PFC, you automatically get that capability. Speed. You don't have to develop a framework of your own. You can use this framework and then build your business logic on top of that. The infrastructure stuff is all taken care of. It's cost effective. Once again, you're not building your base infrastructure. That's been taken care of. You don't even have to maintain it necessarily. What you get to focus on is your business logic, the stuff above the infrastructure level. Lower learning curve for new hires. The PFC is a very popular PowerBuilder framework. A number of the other libraries fell to the wayside over the years. PowerBuilder Foundation classes continues on. And that means that there's a very good likelihood if you're hiring new developers that they are going to come in already experienced using PFC. And then you won't have to train them. And let's say if you had a proprietary framework that you were using that you developed yourself, where you might have to train them to use it. They come in with that training already. And you share maintenance costs. If you discover a bug in PFC or if there's some new feature you'd like to see added, you can come to the community and say, here's this bug, or here's this new feature we'd like to have added. Is there anybody that is interested in developing that? And there's a chance that somebody else will actually do that work for you, and then you just reap the benefit without paying the price there. So we're supported by a community of developers. The good thing about that, if let's say I decide that I'm going to retire and fade off into the sunset, the project doesn't die. It continues on because there are other developers that are still out there actively doing PowerBuilder work and are involved in the project. And you could become one of them. We'll cover that a bit later. So you've got some reassurances that the project's not going to disappear if one particular developer disappears. We use permissive licensing. We use the MIT license to be specific. The thing you need to be cautious of is that although other frameworks might indicate that they are open source, if you look at their source code, you might find that there's actually a much more restrictive license being mentioned in the source code. What that means, and it may not be intentional, but what it means is that there's dual licensing occurring. And you don't have to take my word for it. Google dual licensing or multi-licensing. Check out the Wikipedia page on it. Generally what that means is that if there's a permissive license that is being indicated is used for the framework, and there is a restrictive license also being referenced, they both apply, which means the terms of the restrictive license apply. So if you developed an application using a framework that had copyright statements such as this, and you distributed it to customers, you could be technically running foul of the copyright on the framework. That's not an issue with the PowerBuilder Foundation classes. We use the MIT. You are free to distribute it in commercial applications. Another advantage here is that because we are hosted on GitHub, you can go in and you can review the code. Anybody can go in and review the code. And what that helps to ensure is that somebody's copyrighted software, somebody else's work, is not inadvertently added to the project without their permission. If the source code's not readily accessible in a readable format on the internet, you don't necessarily have that assurance. And that becomes a problem for you, particularly, let's say your company gets bought out by another company and they want to do an IP audit, and they come in and say, can you show that the software you use to build your application isn't using code that actually belongs to somebody else without their permission? The fact that we're hosted on GitHub and the code is readily accessible by anybody over the internet really gives you an assurance that we haven't incorporated somebody else's code without their consent. So let's say you're already using the PowerBuilder Foundation classes, but you're on an earlier version. Why would you want to necessarily upgrade? What's the return on the investment? What's the ROI here? So I wanted to go through some of the changes that have been made in the PowerBuilder Foundation classes lately. When this was originally introduced by Sybase, it was really focused on working with SQL Anywhere. There were some scripts they provided to allow you to create the tables, let's say in Oracle or in SQL Server or other databases. But the data windows, let's say themselves, were actually targeted for SQL Anywhere, and if you tried to go to use them with SQL Server or Oracle, you actually need to make adjustments to them. What we've done here is, at least for SQL Server 2022, is we've made those adjustments. Now the data windows are structured so they can be used with either database without having to be modified. And the application code has been updated to ensure that it works both of those databases. We removed obsolete objects in the PowerBuilder 5.0 timeframe. It was actually possible to use PowerBuilder on AIX, HPUX, Solaris, and obviously 32-bit Windows, because 32-bit Windows was the version of Windows then. And actually a Mac as well. There was a Mac version for a while. Those have all gone by the wayside, and really the only thing that's supported right now is the 64-bit version of Windows. And so we removed the the platform and file services objects that were for these other platforms that are no longer supported. we've added PFC wrapper objects for objects that have been added, objects and controls that have been added in PowerBuilder recently, such as coder object, compressor object, scripter object, extractor object. You can read the list there, and that's still not a complete list, all the wrapper objects we've created. None of them necessarily have any extension code in them yet, but they're available for us to do that. We've added a NCust app preference service. What this allows you to do is to take the application configuration information that you would store in an INI file and move it to an XML file instead, or pull it from the registry. We've added the NCust color object already existed, but we added over 50 additional color constants based on the values that you can select in the PowerBuilder designers. We've added an NCust debug, and what that does is it allows you to view data window data as JSON for debugging. We added an NCust color converter service so that you can do conversion between, let's say, RGB and, well, any of these other color formats. There's also a conversion object that was in the original PFC. We've extended it to handle 240 more PowerBuilder types. We've added an NCust environment object that returns information about the host environment. NCust file service, that was an existing service. We've extended it with methods to create directory trees, get the system directory, short path, long path, Windows directory, move files, get temp file path, and get temp file name. There was an existing NCust INI file method. We added a method to create a new empty INI file if one didn't exist. Well, we added an NCust JSON object because at one point PowerBuilder didn't have JSON capability. This has actually now pretty much been rendered obsolete, though, because Appian has introduced the JSON parser, JSON package, and JSON generator objects. We have an NCust measure conversion object, which allows you to do conversion between metric and English, metric to metric, or even English to English for distance, weight, temperature, pressure, or force. So in other words, centimeters to inches, centimeters to meters, or inches to feet. You know, that's what I mean by metric to English, metric to metric, or English to English. We have an NCust, well, there was an NCust metadata object. We've extended it to return initial values, script functions, events, variables, and arguments. So you can go in and examine the metadata about your own code. There was an NCust numerical object. We added methods to do bitwise operations and to handle hex, octal, and binary numbers. There's a new NCust PB unit conversion object, which handles conversion between inches, twips, PB units, pixels, and centimeters. NCust platform, that was an existing service. We've extended it with methods similar to an earlier service I mentioned that to give you system folder paths, system colors, the DPI for the monitor, system metrics, free memory, and physical memory. There was an existing NCust string object. We've extended it with methods determining if email address is valid, to perform global search and replace, and to remove punctuation or other special characters, and finally to URL encode a string. There was an existing NCust resize object, which handled things like taking an object and saying, I want to keep it at the top, I want to keep it at the bottom, I want to keep it at the right, I want to keep it on the left. That was what was originally in it. We've added functions that allow you to say, I want it to be in the center, center top, center bottom, center left, and center right. And there's a new object in the Windows Service Style object, which allows you to do extended styling capability. There's a Windows API function, set window long A or W now, which allows you to take the standard window style and tweak it a bit. And this wraps those Windows API calls so that you can do it without having to figure out the API calls yourself. The NDS, existing object, we added a OF print setup function for that. NCust split bar was an existing object. but it didn't recognize some of the new PowerBuilder controls. And so we extended it to handle the new control types and to improve movement handling. UHTB is the wrapper for the horizontal track bar. And we extended to add a PFC position changed event so you can script something that responds to changes in the position of the track bar. Same thing with UVTB, the vertical track bar. WMaster is the ancestor class for all the windows in the PFC application. We extended it to add pre-print and post-print events that you can script. WResponse is the ancestor window for all response windows, and we extended that to, because normally a PowerBuilder response window is not resizable, and through WResponse, you can now allow the users actually to resize your response windows. And then the resize service will kick in and obviously resize the controls appropriately for you as well. And then numerous bug fixes. So how do we upgrade to the new PFC? Well, that depends on how you implement it to begin with. So the way PFC works is that all of the actual logic, there's two layers that are provided to you. What's called the PFC layer and what's called the PFE layer. And the PFE layer was the extension layer. That's the one you use in your application. You refer to objects that are in the PFE layer. They all inherit from objects in the PFC layer. So all the code is in the PFC layer, and then you've got these blank extension objects in the PFE layer. Now, there were a couple ways you could extend the code. Perhaps the best, the one I always recommend, is that, and there was a utility that actually came with PFC back when Sybase originally released it, called the PFC extender. And what it would do is it would create an intermediate layer between PFE and PFC called PFD. And that allowed you to take your custom code, not your business logic code. Your business logic code would go above PFE. What it allowed you to do is if you wanted to actually tweak the framework, how the infrastructure works, then you would insert the PFD layer and you would put your code there. And what that meant was when a new version of PFC came along, you could replace the PFC and PFE layers and it wouldn't affect your code. Your code would be in that PFD layer that was added, so it's not affected by the upgrade. That's the ideal situation. If that's what you did, you're in good shape. That's not always what everybody did. So here's an example. Here's so in the PFC layer, all the objects actually start with PFC underscore. This is where the source code is at. Up here, this is the PFE layer. This is the empty objects. They just inherit from the PFC layer. This is what you actually refer to in your business application code. So the UDW is the wrapper for the data window. Let's say you wanted to extend the data window and add some of your own handling for it. What you would do is you'd create a PFD UDW that it inherited from PFC. You would change UDW to inherit from PFD. You would make your changes here. And then when a new version of PFC came along, you would just replace these two layers and your code's sitting over here and it's fine. So that's, like I said, that's the ideal. That's not always the way it was happened though. So if you created a PFD layer, the ideal situation, you replace the PFC layer and the PFE layers with the current version, and you go through your PFE layer, and when there are ancestors in your custom PFD layer, you modify their inheritance so they point to your PFD objects, and you're done. So that's the easy peasy migration. A lot of people did, though, is they just went ahead and directly edited the PFE layer, the one that has no code in it. Still not a big deal. You can replace now the PFC layer with the current version, and you can run a tool. There's a tool out there called Pibble Compare, where you can compare two sets of libraries, and it will tell you what's changed. And so you can go through your PFE layer and you figure out what objects you actually modified, and you can copy those over into the, well, probably that's the easiest thing to do, is copy those objects into the new PFE layer that you got with the new version of the foundation classes. So you just copy over your modified code. So not as simple as the first one, still not that much trouble. This is where you're really going to have some problems, is if you actually edit code in the PFC layer. That's going to make a much tougher migration. Once again, there is that utility called Pibble Compare. It is licensed. It's not terribly expensive. I get no kickback from it. It's just not an endorsed review, whatever you would call that. But my company does have a copy of it, licensed copy of it, because we do use it quite a bit. So you can use that, and you compare the two PFC layers to find out what your changes are. And what I would recommend you do is take those changes and put them in the PFD or PFE layer. So the next time you want to upgrade to the new version of PFC, you can just replace the PFC layer. You don't have to redo the comparison. So, take the hit once for the initial migration and then, coast after that. So how do you contribute to the PFC? Well, the first thing you do is you create a GitHub account for yourself, because we're on GitHub. Then you go into the open source PFC project, and over on the right-hand side, there's a button called Fork. And what you'll do is you fork that, and what that does is it puts a copy of the PFC library in your GitHub space. So it's your own workspace. You get to do whatever you want with it. So then you connect to a workspace from PowerBuilder to your version that is in your GitHub workspace, and it will pull it down, create the pibbles, all that, so you can start using it. So this is where you copy the URL for the project, and then you do a connect to workspace in PowerBuilder. And like I said, at that point, PowerBuilder will just bring down all the code. So after you've made some changes and you want to submit them to the open source PFC project, what you do is you're going to commit to your local repository. You're going to do a push that will put the changes in your copy of PFC, the one in your GitHub workspace. Then you're going to go to GitHub and you're going to create what's called a pull request. And what that does is it takes the changes you made to your project and it sends it over as a pull request into the PFC project. Then one of the members of the PFC project will look at it, and if they like it, they'll merge it into PFC. So this is what it looks like when we approve a merge request. Now this wasn't a real merge request. This is one I just did to demonstrate how this is done. All right, so a little recap. I always heard that when you're trying to share information with people, you should tell them what you're going to be telling them. You should tell them, and then you should remind them what you told them. So that's what I'm going to do here. What we've talked about is why you would want to use the open source foundation classes. If you're using them already, why you would want to upgrade to them. If you decide to upgrade to them, how you go about doing that upgrade. And lastly, how you can contribute to the PowerBuilder Foundation project. Thanks for your attention. One last thing here. Here's how I get information about, not necessarily about the open source foundation classes, but Appian, the Appian community, community.appian.com. So there's forums up there. There's actually a code exchange site there where myself and other people have posted code samples that you're free to use. So there's Appian has a YouTube channel. They're on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Thank you. And time for questions and answers.